morning, noon, or night, wherever and whenever you are listening. You're listening to The Shift. I'm your host. My name is Doug McKenty. This is the 27th episode of The Shift. It's being recorded on the 7th of February, 2018. If you like what you're listening to, please think about becoming a patron. That's patreon.com/The Shift. If you want to find out more information, check out my newsfeed on Facebook at The Shift with Doug McKenty. Join the conversation on Twitter at DMcKenty and find out more about the show and check out my archives at theshiftnow.com. My guest on the show today is independent investigative journalist Christopher Bolin, author of Solving 9/11, The Deception That Changed the World, and more recently, The War on Terror, The Plot to Rule the Middle East. He has also published dozens, if not hundreds of articles debunking the official narrative claiming that 19 members of Al-Qaeda attacked the United States on the orders of Osama bin Laden, and providing evidence that the atrocity was instead a false flag attack planned in advance by members of the U.S. and Israeli intelligence communities designed to create a pretext for war in the Middle East. Christopher became an early advocate for what is now known as the 9/11 Truth Movement when he saw evidence of a cover-up perpetrated by mass media and government officials within the first weeks after the towers fell. By claiming the tragedy of 9/11 an act of war, the government avoided the type of scrutiny required had it been treated as a criminal investigation. Christopher Bolin became the detective on the scene of the crime, uncovering the uncomfortable truths that the mainstream media would not expose while pushing the official government story. His work reveals a plot decades in the making, beginning with Israeli think tanks planning an international war on terror and ending with the biggest cover-up in world history. Christopher Bolin, welcome to the show, and thank you for helping to make the shift. How are you doing today, Christopher?
Thank you, Doug. It's nice to be with you. That's a good introduction. You hit all the nails on the head.
Yeah, good. Thanks a lot. When I started reading in your work about how you were pointing out how it was not treated as a criminal investigation, but rather this act of war, I couldn't have agreed with you 100% more. I mean, it's just that's the central crux of the issue as far as I'm concerned with 9/11. Any criminal any criminal investigation would have been treated so much differently, and that was the way that they worked around having to actually take it seriously, and provide evidence for what really happened.
Exactly. That was the huge legal shift of hand. By the following day, that was the headline on USA Today, the paper from McLean, Virginia, and it said, the headline said, an act of war. And they were pushing this notion that most people saw it as being an act of war, not as a crime. And that was to usher in this sleight of hand that, as you said, precluded any criminal investigation, which is what allowed the government, the FBI, the Department of Justice, to destroy the evidence of this crime, where 3,000 people were killed in broad daylight, and simply call it an act of war, which shifted the entire onus of responsibility to the Department of Defense, and it became a war to go after and to seek justice by attacking another country, Afghanistan, which had nothing to do with 9/11.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually outrageous, and I think if my listeners, if any of them are still skeptical about what really happened on 9/11, if they approach it as a crime, I mean, that to me, that's how you find out. I mean, the right people were not doing the right things to investigate what really happened in the FBI or in the Department of Justice. Can you talk about what should have happened in those first couple of days had it been investigated as a crime, and instead, the cover-up ensued? It becomes so obvious when you look at it from this angle.
Yes, well, the first thing that should have happened is, of course, the preservation of the crime scene and preservation of the evidence. And from the very beginning, this is what we saw happening. We saw that instead of preserving the evidence, we had dump trucks lined up, filling up with the top layer of steel and carting it off to a couple junkyards over in New Jersey, and that continued 24/7. So we had this 24/7 destruction of evidence, criminal evidence from the crime scene of the murder of 2,500 people there in downtown Manhattan. And the evidence was, the steel evidence was taken away, cut into pieces 5 feet and shorter, mixed with other scrap, and sent to China. I mean, this is the thing. People don't really appreciate, don't understand this, that rather than investigate the crime, rather than looking at the evidence to see what happened to the towers while people died, the evidence was destroyed from the very beginning. this is criminal. And this is also one, this is where you could legally attack the government's entire case by showing that they destroyed the evidence from a crime scene. The legalese, calling it an act of war, that's what they did. But still, it's a crime in which, we need to find out who destroyed those buildings, how were they destroyed, and this is a New York crime mass murder of 2,600 people, and it should be investigated even today. It needs to be investigated.
Yeah, it's pretty phenomenal, really. Christopher, can you let us know, because what really surprised me about reading your story was how quickly you were able to turn on to the fact that this was not as it seemed. I mean, it took me, 9/11 was a real pivotal event for me, but it still took me a year before I had even heard of what a false flag attack was, and then another probably couple of years doing my own research, before I finally convinced myself that this could be the case. But you, within a few weeks, had already managed to come to the conclusion that there was some kind of cover-up taking place. So can you explain, your history? I know that you had studied Israeli-Palestinian issues in college, and then had already covered some false flag attacks. Just to describe for my listeners, how you were able to so quickly come to the conclusion that this was a cover-up that was happening.
Well, as you said, I have a degree from the University of California, and I studied Israel and Palestinian history. And one thing that is clear from the United States alliance with Israel over the past decades is that this allegiance to Israel, this habitual friendship with the state of Israel, gets America into bigger and bigger trouble. And so it's only a matter of time until we are taken to war because of this alliance. And that's what we've been doing for the last 16 years. But regarding 9/11, it became very clear we were being lied to on day one and day two already, because on the first day there were many reports of explosions at the World Trade Center. Lots of eyewitnesses, people in and around the buildings talked about the explosions they saw and felt, and it was never discussed again. It was reported on the first day on the BBC World Television. It was reported in People magazine. It was reported in the televisions, but then certain aspects of the events of 9/11 were then clearly being omitted from the narrative. And there were two that I noticed right away. One was these reports of explosions, and second, there was these Israeli suspects who had been apprehended in New Jersey or New York on 9/11, scores of them. And, this was only reported once and then never reported again. And the reports of the arrested Israelis, they're called the 5 dancing Israelis who were arrested in New Jersey, was only reported in the local New Jersey newspaper, which was very odd. It was not reported in the New York papers at all. So these two things gave me a very clear indication that we were getting a sanitized version. And when you get a sanitized version of something so outrageous as 9/11, there's got to be a reason for it. And that's when you start noticing the cover-up. And my history as a journalist in Washington, D.C. had been, I had worked on cover-ups of exactly this kind of thing. TWA Flight 800. Prior to that, I had studied this sinking of a ship in Europe called the Estonia, where 1,000 people died. So I was familiar with this government cover-ups of atrocities that need to be covered up. And 9/11 became one of them.
Yeah, it's just fascinating to me. It actually blew my mind. I think the hardest thing for me to be able to get over as I was doing my own research into this was how the mainstream media can be so controlled. Because that's what's hard to wrap your mind around, I think, for the average citizen, is they're watching the news and they think that, well, there's so many competing news sources here that they must all be doing real investigative journalism, and they must be sort of competing to suss out the truth, and there's no way that some of these reporters aren't going to discover the truth. How do you explain how the mainstream media is able to really, across the board on the national level? This is another thing you brought up, the local papers will cover things, but what gets filtered into the national level, and then on the national level, there seems to be this ability for the government or the corporate media or whatever that institution is to present some kind of a narrative across the board. How do you think that mechanism functions?
Well, it's It's basically the control of the media at a huge level. The corporate media in the United States is now something like 90% of the media outlets are owned by something like 6 corporations. So this is a media conglomeration type situation that we've never seen before in a democratic state. And this gives these 6 corporations almost complete control over what's heard, as you said, at a national level. And so they've created this like CBS News, for example, the guys that make 60 Minutes and whatnot. The president and CEO of 60 Minutes of CBS News is I think he's the grandnephew of the founding prime minister of the state of Israel, David Ben-Gurion. The man that runs CBS News is named Leslie Moonves. And so you have a situation where you have huge media outlets in the United States controlled by very few corporations, and these corporations will not challenge the government and certainly will not be critical of the state of Israel. And so you have this what I call a pro-Zionist controlled media in the United States, which is very, very bad. Because this is the situation where Americans are basically treated like children locked in a dark closet. Because in order for people in a democratic state to be able to make decisions and understand the world, they need to have complete, unfettered access to information. And of course, the media in the United States has never been, completely free and neutral and unbiased and all that. But now the situation is alarming, because we've had for 16 years a war in the Middle East based on 9/11, the lies of 9/11. And 16 years now we have had no information from the national media about the truth of 9/11, no investigation of their own, and a complete pro-war attitude in what has become America's longest and most expensive war. I mean, this is outrageous. We cannot survive as a nation when we do not have a free press.
Yeah, I mean, the wars that have been going on in the Middle East have gotten way out of control, so expensive, and to this day, what fascinates me is that the American people really have been given no actual reason. I think even most Americans know that, the whole weapons of mass destruction thing in Iraq was bogus, and yet there's not even any kind of an anti-war movement that's actually happening to try to prevent this from continuing,
Right. That's the most outrageous thing, and that's the reason I wrote this little book, the latest book called The War on Terror, The Plot to Rule the Middle East, because I made it in the idea of a common sense pamphlet like Thomas Paine wrote back at the Revolution time. A small book, 150, 60 pages, easily read, very straightforward, concise, and to the point, because people need to understand that the war on terror is a fraud. And it's not just a fraud, it's a fraud that's meant to destroy our nation as well. We're being plundered. As I said, this war has already cost us trillions of dollars. The range is between $2.5 trillion on the conservative side and $5.5 trillion on the accrued cost down the road. And like you said, there's no resistance to it, because the American people do not understand it. They don't understand that they've been lied to, and the lies have a purpose. The lies of 9/11 serve the purpose of starting the war on terror. So that when you understand 9/11 truth, when you understand that we've been lied to about 9/11, then you can understand that the war on terror is a fraud. Then you understand we're living in a paradigm of lies.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's almost impossible, or it's difficult for a lot of people to wrap their minds around that we're almost living in a matrix where, especially when it comes to foreign policy, there's a construct that's been formulated that's really not reality. It's this American perspective that the government has pushed on us that is somehow able to be kind of blanketed across all of the major news networks, and people just consume this information without double checking. And now they have a worldview that is wholly inaccurate. I have been finding that about this whole Russiagate thing that's happening as well. Like, people just don't even get the relationship with Russia and the United States and the rest of the world and what's happening, and we're just demonizing Russia,
Right. Right, that's a very good point. Because actually, Russia is not the threat. The game to keep the United States and Russia at odds with each other is a media game. There is no indication that Russia interfered with our elections whatsoever.
Right.
But you see, they play this. This is the main story day after day after day. Because by talking about this, they do not have to talk. They will not talk about the war, for example, in Syria or what have you, Iraq, Afghanistan. So it serves a purpose. As they demonize Russia, it takes the focus off of the disaster in the Middle East. And Israel, the Zionists, prefer this because as long as Russia and the United States are at odds with each other, there's no force for them to make compromises with the Palestinians.
Right. I mean, and this is what everybody is ignoring. I mean, this is the elephant in the room, which is the Palestinian issue. That's another thing, I had to get woken up to myself, just being raised with this very pro-Israeli perspective that is sort of force-fed to everyone. And then I don't even know how it happened to me. One day I woke up and was like, what about the millions of Palestinians that are living in an apartheid state? Like what?
Right.
Why can't we be critical of this? What's going on? Where's the conversation about this that really needs to happen? And, that helped to kind of open my mind to what was really going on. So in the war on terror, why don't we go ahead and get into this now? You talk about Benjamin Netanyahu, Israeli think tanks, way back in the late 70s, already talking about an international war on terror, and you discussed the Yinon plan. So can you get into some of that? Because that was the most interesting thing for me, was that history, because it shows how long this whole thing has really been in the making.
Yeah. Well, there was a fundamental shift in Israel in the late 70s when the Likud party came to power. The Likud is the party of Benjamin Netanyahu. He's the chairman of the party now. It was founded by a guy named Menachem Begin. He was the notorious terrorist who blew up the King David Hotel back in 1946 in Jerusalem. But this is the party, the Likud party is the party of the terrorists from the 40s in Palestine, Israel. Yitzhak Shamir, and Menachem Begin, and all of that. Those people who were notorious terrorists in the pre-state Israel, and they came to power in 1977, and they put back into effect their use of terrorism. And right away, they began planning for this war on terror, which would bring the United States and the Western democracies into the Middle East, waging war against those groups and nations that are opposed to the state of Israel. So, in order to push this onto the world platform, they had a conference in Jerusalem in 1979 called the International Conference on Terrorism at the Netanyahu Institute, where Benjamin Netanyahu and his father had, created this venue, and Menachem Begin was the arranger, the key organizer of the conference. And there were 4 heads of Israeli military intelligence at the 3-day conference, which shows you that Israeli military intelligence was a key player in this entire construct. And George Bush was there. Papa Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush, was there, spoke at the final day, the final session. He was a candidate for president at the time in 1979. And they basically rolled out this idea that international terrorism was the new boogeyman on the planet. And they said at that conference that the player behind all of the international terrorism was none other than the Soviet Union, of course. And so in this way, they made it an anti-Soviet, anti-terrorist conference. And, they would say that the Palestinians are trained in Moscow or the Syrians are trained in Moscow, what have you. Therefore, Moscow's behind the whole thing.
Wow.
Wasn't the case, but in any that's why it's important to understand this. Who is the driving wedge between Russia and the United States? It's the Israelis. The Zionist platform always has been. But now they rolled out this idea, and then there were hundreds of people from the media, from all the media around Europe and the United States, and then they started coming out with these editorials about how international terrorism was the new threat to Western civilization. And the logic is very simple. Netanyahu's logic goes like this. It says that Israel is attacked by Islamic terrorists only because it is a Western state. And it's like the Western state that's most easily accessible to the Muslims. Therefore, That's why they are attacked.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, it's anti-Western. The terrorism is really aimed at the West. Therefore, he says, it's incumbent on the Western allies to come and defend Israel. That's his logic, right? And so they rolled it out in 1979, and then they started making movies about it. You know, Arnon Milchan, the big Israeli producer down in Hollywood who made Pretty Woman and JFK,
mm-hmm.
he came out with this film in 1978. The first film he made was called The Medusa Touch, which featured a Boeing 747 smashing into a high-rise that looks like the Pan Am building in New York City. That was the climactic scene in his movie. And they began. The head of Israeli intelligence, the former head of Mossad, predicted in 1979 that Arabs would attack the tallest building in New York City, you know, because that was our symbol of fertility, whatever. And so it's like the idea came out, and they started pushing the idea. Started pushing two ideas: the idea of a horrendous attack on a high-rise with a plane in New York City, and a war on terrorism where the United States would lead the Western allies into the war in the Middle East. And they finally, in 2001, were able to achieve the 9/11 attack, which then made their war on terror operational. And there we have it. And now for 16 years, you know, like the blind leading the blind, we've been in this mess. We do not have the public awareness to get out of it, which is why I have tried, you know, very hard to educate my fellow Americans and citizens in the world
mm-hmm.
about what is really behind the war on terror and why we have to understand it so we can end it.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. It's fascinating to me how powerless the American people seem to be. Like, they just roll these things out and they don't care what everybody thinks, you know? And then at this point, the people have just become complacent about it. I mean, I don't know. You know, it's so challenging to figure out how to affect politics in this day and age. I mean, you talked a little bit in one of your articles that I read about the electronic voting machines. I mean, I don't even know that voting matters anymore in the United States with these things and the way they're operating, you know? So it's
right.
challenging to be able to figure out even how to affect change in the current environment because we're not able to have the right conversations even. I mean, that's why... You know, you are doing independent journalism, and I'm doing this program just because we have to get on, you know, on these internet platforms essentially to even be able to start having the right conversations, much less be able to turn them into a national conversation, which is where they need to be, you know, had.
Right. You're exactly right. You know, today we have a democracy that Americans participate in only by watching television. You know, it's like we have this fake, a sham democracy. As you said, you know, first of all, vote counting is a very simple, straightforward thing. If the votes are not counted in the local polling place before the public's eyes, you do not have an open and transparent election.
Right.
Full stop. And that has not existed in most places in America for decades. And furthermore, the selection of the candidates, how we wind up getting these candidates. And if you remember the last election, when it started a couple years ago, they rolled out two guys. They rolled out Jeb Bush and Hillary Clinton. I mean, these are the sons and daughters of the most notorious crime families in America.
Right.
As candidates we're supposed to choose from, it was ludicrous. But that's the thing, is that so Americans kind of have become complacent, as you said. That we tend to think that everything's fine if we vote every 4 years, you know, and we watch TV news, we're informed,
mm-hmm.
but it's, you know, democracy is not a spectator sport. It's a participatory sport.
Right.
You have to be involved. You have to be engaged. You know, if you come to Europe and look at like a country like Switzerland, which is a really democratic state, they have elections 4 times a year. And any serious thing that pertains to the government of Switzerland will be voted on by the public at one of those elections. So, you know, that's the kind of democracy that America is supposed to have. You know, the Swiss state actually took the American Constitution and basically put that into effect in their country.
Right.
There's only one difference. The only difference is that they have made the executive office weaker.
Mm-hmm.
The president is not. It's not a 4-year term. It's a 1-year, you know, appointed term, like the original Constitution had in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no question that the democracy is failing here in the U.S., and it's due in a large part because people are so ill-informed. And it's, as you say, we're all taught that as long as we keep ourselves, if we're reading the New York Times and we're watching CNN, then we're doing our part to participate in this democracy. But we're really getting fed, a pack of lies and a worldview that's simply not accurate. I mean, what you're talking about brings to mind the fact that this whole Russia conversation that we're happening actually started, to my mind, I think, as a cover-up for the DNC fixing the primary against Bernie Sanders. I mean, there's all sorts of proof and evidence that election was completely rigged, and everybody's talking about, well, did the Russians hack the emails or not? And it's like, right. Well, who cares who hacked the emails? Because the emails show you that the DNC rigged the election, right? I mean...
Yeah. It serves, the whole Russiagate thing serves as a distraction, like I said, from more important things where you have, real culpability on the part of people like Hillary Clinton and whoever. So in order to keep the public distracted and to keep the Russian bear over there as the boogeyman, they go on and on with this thing. And, you have to consider that Mr. Mueller, who's the head of this investigation on Russia, was the head of the FBI when 9/11 occurred.
Yeah.
And he participated in what is essentially the greatest cover-up in U.S. history.
Yeah.
Because there was no investigation, and the investigative authority, the agency who actually was involved in destroying evidence, was the FBI.
Yeah, I mean, you see that time and time again, don't you, when it comes to 9/11, is that it's not, these people... Even according to the official narrative, these people made terrible mistakes then. How could they have let this happen? The security was completely lax, whatever, yada, yada. Even if you follow the official narrative, and yet all the people who apparently made these horrific mistakes on 9/11, they all got raises, Right. And then you dig a little bit deeper, you find, of course, well, they really were just helping with the cover-up, and that's why. And then they got bonuses and raises and advances because of what they were doing. It's just phenomenal to watch. Right. I mean, once you see what happened, and that's another thing that kind of came to mind about talking about the DNC primaries, or like even what you say, something that's so obvious as if you go to try to see how our votes are counted in the United States, you find out that the whole election thing is really a sham. It's so beyond fraudulent, anybody that even looks into it. And yet there's this sleight of hand that happens that I think most Americans would prefer to live in denial about what's really going on, because then they can just pretend like they live in the greatest democracy in the history of the world, like they get force-fed in schools, and they don't have to really deal with the problems. But this sleight of hand is exactly what happened on 9/11. I mean, even for me, like you see 100-story buildings, 100-plus story buildings collapse straight down in their own footprint. And that didn't happen because a plane hit them. There's no way,
Right, exactly. And you see, there were, in my presentations, I showed just a couple little things to show people that the obviousness of the lie. And the most obvious thing is that molten iron, a molten metal that appears to be iron, poured off of the 81st floor, which is the plane went into the 81st floor of the South Tower. It poured off that floor for 7 minutes before that tower fell. And, the dust that rolled through Manhattan contained about 10% tiny droplets of molten iron. Mm-hmm. And then finally, when they started removing the rubble away from the World Trade Center, when they got down to the bedrock of Manhattan, they found molten steel. They called it molten steel, molten iron, in the molten state under all three towers that fell that day. North Tower, South Tower, and Building 7. And it's like, hello, none of this computes. There is no way that the official version of what happened on 9/11 can create molten iron or molten steel in that amount.
Yeah.
And this is this is not me making this up. These are not pictures that come from some dubious source. This is WABC TV showed it on TV to the people who watched in New York City that day. So there's no question about it, and it's but because it does not fit into the official myth, the mainstream media will not talk about it. You can't. The media doesn't get off very easily on this. There is no way that the mainstream media in the United States can ever redeem itself for the cover-up of 9/11.
Right.
And the media is not a small player in this. The media is the source of our information. And you know, these people that head the U.S. media and the politicians that have been part of the cover-up are guilty of no less than treason.
I go back to it because I think, again, that's the hardest thing for people to wrap their minds around, that CNN and MSNBC and Fox News, because, you know, maybe it's even because the myth that's built is that they're competing against each other and one's on the left and one's on the right and they're trying to outdo each other when really they're all pushing this same narrative, you know. But
right.
People really want to believe the media, and it's so difficult for them to get that, no, you know, this is all bought off. This is all... You know, I don't know.
Right.
I try to explain it these days to people that they all get paid by the same corporations, and all that corporate money that goes into the commercials that you watch is a conflict of interest. So you can't be paying attention to news that you're getting that's being paid for by the very corporations, you know, that these people are supposed to be reporting upon. You know.
Yeah. And these media outlets are all pro-war.
Yeah.
And that's really important to see, that there is no neutral reporting of this 16-year-old war as there was in the time of Vietnam. You know, in the days of Vietnam, we got pictures on TV, we got pictures in Life magazine
right.
of what the ugliness of the war in Vietnam. Today, there's nothing like that.
Yeah.
And so it's all sanitized, and so that the American people think, oh, this is just, we're doing an operation here or an operation there. It's like clinical, surgical, painless. And, you know, occasionally a report comes, oh, 4 American soldiers were killed in Mali. Where's Mali?
Yeah.
Or in Niger. Where's Niger? What are we doing there?
Right.
You know, we are engaged in war across the world. You know, and it's the chances that these operations will get uglier and out of control, it could happen any day. It could happen any day. There could be something in the Persian Gulf that would lead to a shooting war with Iran or something. Or something could happen in Syria that would lead to a war with Russia.
Right.
This is dangerous stuff.
Well, this downing of the plane that happened just a few days ago, you know, by Syrian troops that were trained and using American-made weapons, you know, like that was huge news. You know, talking like you're talking about, that could easily lead to a serious conflict with Russia, and almost no press. You know, it's like, what?
Right, and that's why that's why they have to keep up this Russiagate thing, so that Americans are constantly thinking that Russia is the demon, Russia is the villain, so that if something does, because things have gone really wrong for the U.S. and Israel and their allies in Syria. The Russians came in and have been an obstacle to their breaking up of that country.
Right.
So that they have to vilify Russia, so that, you know, because Russia is winning on the field.
Yeah. I mean, it is actually amazing to watch Putin. I just thought it was so brilliant. And this was something that actually changed my whole attitude about it, and why I don't fall for the anti-Russia propaganda anymore. It's watching Putin eliminate the chemical weapons from the field and forcing Obama to back down when he was planning a major invasion of Syria. When was that, in 2013 or 2014? Yeah. You know, with the red line that he drew, they were planning a major, it was going to be a second Iraq. And then Putin stepped in and said, hey, you know, we're going to eliminate all the chemical weapons from the field. Assad has agreed to this. We're going to give them to the UN, completely neutralize the aggression from the U.S. And now, you know, the country is, the whole plan to break up, and this goes back to this Yinon plan from Israel from decades ago, to break up Syria, to break up Iraq. Well, will you go back to this? I mean, I'd like to talk a little bit more about Syria, but this decades-old plan to balkanize the entire Middle East is an Israeli plan that now the U.S. military is essentially continuing to, you know, try to enforce.
Yes, exactly. The game plan, the strategy behind the war on terror is something called the Yinon plan, written by a man named Oded Yinon, an Israeli strategist with Ariel Sharon and the Likud. And he wrote this in 1982. It was published in a magazine by the World Zionist Organization in Jerusalem. And thanks to a professor at Hebrew University named Israel Shahak, this document was translated into English and then printed in the United States the same year by the Organization of Arabic Students in Boston. And so we were made aware of this plan, the Israeli plan to dominate the region, which calls for the breaking up of all the Arab states into ethnic statelets. This is called something Balkanization often because it's exactly the idea that was applied to Yugoslavia, that you break up the secular state of Yugoslavia, that was a sort of socialist state under Tito. Mm-hmm. They broke up Yugoslavia along ethnic and religious lines. So you wound up with, instead of one state, you wound up with like 7 mini-states, all of whom today are weak and poor, much worse off than they were under Yugoslavia.
Right.
And this is exactly the game that they're playing in Iraq, in Syria, Somalia, Libya, Yemen, across the entire region. And we see it, for example, in Syria. The United States, along with the Kurdish forces that they've allied with and armed, has taken control of the entire eastern part of Syria, basically from the Euphrates River to the east, to the border with Iraq and Turkey in the north. And so this entire third, about 1/3 of the country, is now U.S.-controlled territory. And the same thing they did in Iraq. They lopped off the northern part and said this is now Kurdistan. And they actually had a vote for independence that didn't go very well. You know,
right.
The Iraqis challenged it and said, no way. But this is the game plan. So what you see, you have to ask yourself, what is the American interest in Syria? I mean, very few Americans have ever been to Syria. There's no American interest there. We have no stick in the fire there.
Right.
So why are we fighting there? Why are we spending all this money? Why are we spending $100 million a day in Afghanistan?
Yeah.
The war in Afghanistan is costing us $100 million a day. So they spend more money in 1 week in Afghanistan than they spend on Amtrak in a whole year. And that's why the trains in America are going off the track every day.
Can we talk about the opium in Afghanistan for a minute? Because that seems to me to be the only reason why we're there. It's like because the CIA really loves to run drugs. I mean.
Yep. That could very well be it. Because what I found in my book, Solving 9/11: The Deception Changed the World, in the second chapter of that book, I wrote about the planes, and I point out that the Israeli military has a lot of plane facilities, aircraft facilities in the United States and in Colombia. And
right.
They have one in Bogota, Colombia. And, you have to understand that the Israelis in Iran-Contra at that time and further, along with the Bush family and the Clinton family, these 3 entities are up to their eyeballs in the drug trade from Colombia and South America to the United States. It was, Bill Clinton was the governor in Arkansas. George Herbert Walker Bush was the vice president working out of the basement of the White House. And David Kimke was the Mossad guy who ran the whole thing. David Kimke, who happens to be related to a journalist named Greg Palast.
Huh.
That's another story.
Interesting, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, fascinating. And now we've got this opioid epidemic in the United States, and we're wondering, well, how the heck did that happen? Where did this come from? It must have nothing to do with the the trillions of dollars worth of heroin being produced out of Afghanistan now that the U.S. is in control.
It's like shades of Vietnam. It's shades of Vietnam
absolutely.
all over again.
Yeah.
That you have this war in Indochina. You have this Laotian, Burmese, Vietnamese heroin coming into the United States, and a chronic of heroin overdoses, what have you. Yeah, this is the demoralization of our country, and this is opium is a very key part of it, because the opium, of course, the drug trade gives these agencies tons and tons of black cash that they can just operate with, and it's that. And then by certain politicians being controlled, like the Bush family and Clinton family being controlled, they are then servants for life to the other parties involved in the crime, because nothing keeps people more closely tied to each other than a crime committed together.
Right. Well, and it all ties back to the 9/11 deception and this war on terror deception that you're describing. I mean, they're using this as the front story, like the cover story for all of this, clandestine black operations happening in the background. It's insane. I mean, you can see that they've been cashing in. I mean, God, the Bush family, they're gun runners. They're making money just selling guns to everybody that's fighting the war on terror. They had so much conflict of interest going on that it's through the roof when you start really digging behind the scenes. It's not because they hate us for our freedom,
Yeah, of course not. Of course not. And, the thing is about George Bush, the president, and Clinton, these people have committed huge, huge crimes. And I remember during the campaign when Hillary Clinton was speaking to Donald Trump. Donald Trump says, "Yeah, you're lucky I'm not in the White House because you'd be in jail."
Right.
Well, it's been a year now, and I don't see that she's gotten any closer to jail.
Yeah, I mean, what do you think happened there? I feel like, Donald Trump actually kind of rode this wave of the independent or conspiracy journalism, if you will. I mean, heck, he was on Alex Jones's show, and he's courting that percentage of the population, which actually, I mean, this was the first election where that political perspective actually even gained any notice from the politicians or the political class was actually running for office. So it's become big enough for them to notice, but then it seemed like they were just co-opted into voting for Trump, and then Trump got elected, and now it's business as usual, same old, just like it ever was. But although there was this hiccup that happened that the mainstream media didn't know how to deal, for the first 6 months of the Trump presidency, they just didn't have the narrative to even deal with his conspiracy talk, or like somehow some of this, that the mainstream media was fake news, this whole fake news meme. In fact, I mean, what do you think that was? It was so fascinating. It wasn't really a coherent conversation. It's like the mainstream didn't know how to even incorporate, these independent memes into their narrative, and then they just produce all of a sudden this fake news thing, and now it's sort of like business as usual. But what an interesting, event that happened there.
Yeah, well, I was in the States in the summer before the election, and I watched how it seemed to me that it was very clear that Fox News was giving Trump lots and lots of time. Donald Trump was, Fox News was, and Trump had a thing going where he was getting a lot of good coverage. Mm-hmm. Now, if Donald Trump had truly been the populist maverick that he wants to be, he wouldn't get any time at all. He would be like a Ron Paul or Pat Buchanan. You wouldn't hear of him on the TV at all. So this indicated to me that there was a more sophisticated game going on here. Mm-hmm. That they were, the CNN versus Fox News, like you said, the Alex Jones people versus the mainstream media, and they were just playing up this. They were playing with the American populist vote to give them a candidate that they would vote for.
Yeah.
And like make it look like there's real change. Well, Donald Trump is a new kind of candidate. He does a lot of strange things.
Yeah.
But if he would do the things that he promised in the candidacy, what people voted for, primarily end the wars in the Middle East. I don't care about his hairstyle if he ends the war in the Middle East, and if he would repair relations with Russia. There's no reason for us to have this animosity with Russia. In Western Europe, it's crazy. I live in Western Europe, and there's a great deal of fear being pushed on the people of Eastern Europe and Western Europe. Mm-hmm. That Russia's going to invade.
Wow.
And this is all contrived.
Right.
So, there's no reason for the United States and Russia not to be friends, and then to, of course, end the war and then rebuild American infrastructure. There have been like 4 or 5 calamities on Amtrak in the last month.
Yeah.
This is nuts. This is absolutely nuts. Here you have a country that sends people to the moon and Mars and can't run trains on tracks across the country. And then finally, of course, the 800-pound gorilla is investigate 9/11.
Yeah.
Investigate 9/11 and end the war. But Trump talked about ending the war, patching up relations with Russia, and building infrastructure. And so far, those have not gone very fast forward.
Right. Yeah, I mean, amazing. God, I'm thinking of so many things. I'm having flashbacks of that Ron Paul election. People acted like Bernie Sanders was the first time somebody got treated so poorly by the mainstream media, but really, Ron Paul, it was exactly the same thing. Like I remember him coming in, second place in primary elections, and the mainstream media would literally skip over. So-and-so got first place, so-and-so got third place, and they just wouldn't say his name,
Yeah,
It's like, whoa. And so I totally see where you're coming from, because you see when the media doesn't want somebody to get elected, they just don't mention them at all. They just ignore them completely. And Trump, I mean, I think it was like $1 billion in free, campaign advertising, basically. He was getting so much coverage. It was through the roof. So something was going on there.
That's right.
Yeah, what an interesting thing. I mean, I almost gave him a little bit of a chance, but then when he bombed Syria, there was that obvious false flag. Here's another thing I heard you say, actually, is that since 9/11, false flags have become the norm instead of the exception. And I so agree.
Yeah.
Like, whenever a terrorist attack occurs, I mean, it's almost, at this point, it's like terrorism doesn't even really exist at all. It's all false flag attacks. And this attack, chemical attack in Syria, all of a sudden, Trump is bombing Syria. And now, again, across the board, the mainstream media is all like, praising the greatness of America, for bombing Syria, for doing nothing. It was insane. It was just insane.
That was the one thing that he did. That was the one thing that he did that the media supported.
Yeah.
If you bomb Syria, they love it.
Right.
But everything else that he says or does is they take issue with.
Yeah. Amazing. Amazing. And amazing that it does all go back to 9/11. I mean, this deception that you're talking about is it's so valid because it has, as you were talking, we're talking about Syria, Iraq, these other places, Yemen, Nigeria, Somalia. It's like we don't even know all the places where U.S. troops are fighting in this war on terror right now because the war on terror, the Congress wrote a blank check. I mean, I don't even know if Americans really realize this, that Congress is supposed to vote anytime there's a conflict abroad. The president's not supposed to just be able to start killing people. Congress is supposed to vote. But instead, Congress has given this authorization for the war on terror, and now the president is just fighting a perpetual war. It's essentially abrogating their constitutional responsibility 100%. And now that we have a dictator who can fight wars wherever, whenever they want, without telling us about it.
That's right. Authorization to use military force, written just a couple days after 9/11, gives the president the right to go to war in any country where he sees some connection to 9/11. But the thing is that it's now been completely abused. Like we're fighting ISIS in Syria or whatever, and ISIS has nothing to do with the people who did 9/11. But that doesn't matter. And what's most atrocious about this is that although Barbara Lee from California tried to get a debate going on this authorization to use military force, which is the war on terror, which is, as you said, the blank check and the an open-ended perpetual war. This has to be debated. Congress has to man up, and they have to debate this properly, the war on terror and the funding for it, because it is taking the food off of our tables.
Yeah.
This is, when you say this is the most expensive war in U.S. history, you compare that with, in second place, World War II. So that only lasted for 4 years.
Right.
This has gone up for four times as long, and with great expenses. So if we no nation can survive war for a protracted period of time. Lao Tzu said that.
Right.
And we have to understand that we cannot. He said there is no instance of a nation benefiting from prolonged warfare. And the Afghanistan took the Soviet Union down, and the United States is not benefiting in any way from this continuous perpetual war. Congress has to debate that. When Barbara Lee got that amendment in to debate the war on terror, in the middle of the night, Paul Ryan, the Speaker of the House, cut it out.
Yeah.
Shut it off. And stop any debate. I mean, this is bad. This is the kind of thing that happens in a banana republic.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've got to wake up and come to the realization that that's where we're at. I mean, Americans really, I don't, it's so much easier to sit back and think that we're the greatest country in the world and the freest people in the world. But it's just time for Americans to realize that that's not the case. We are no longer any of those things. We got more people in prison than anybody else ever. That's not a free society, people. We have elections that are a sham.
When you do not live in the truth, you cannot be great.
Right.
When the people are deceived, when a nation is deceived, when a nation is enslaved to lies, this is what 9/11 was meant to do. It was meant to enslave us to this lie, very much in the same way that Germany has been enslaved to this Holocaust myth, or whatever you call it. Mm-hmm. And they have to pay and pay and pay and pay, and Germans can't, get off their knees. In the same way, a little bit different, America has been burdened with this 9/11 myth, which is meant to take us to perpetual war. I mean, this has to stop. Our nation, there will be nothing left for our grandchildren if we don't stop. It's really serious, and that's why we have to wrap our heads around the fraud of 9/11 and the war on terror, so we can understand who did it and why they did it to us and why our media is supporting it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, and this gets back to your work about 9/11 and that investigative journalism, of looking into it as a criminal act, and it does make me wonder, like, who are the people that are organizing all of this, like this mythology making? Who was it? The neocon that ran the 9/11 Commission that you were talking about? His PhD, his PhD or his thesis was in cultural mythology making. It's like, my God.
His thesis, Philip Zelikow thesis was on the creation and maintenance of the public myth.
That is just.
And he wrote the commission report single-handedly.
Right. Oh my God! I mean, it's so amazing when you look into it. It's just like the PNAC, the Project for a New American Century. They said, "Oh, here's our plan, and we need a new Pearl Harbor in order to act the plan." And then there's a new Pearl Harbor just happening the next year so that they can enact the plan. It's like they told you they were going to do it, people. They told you, and then they did it, and no one is doing anything about it. I mean,
Right. It's sad. It's very sad.
Yeah.
And that's why 9/11 truth is the most important issue of our time. Because a lot of people think, oh, that was a long time ago, 3,000 people died, it was terrible, but that was long ago and far away. No, the consequences, we are still living and suffering under the consequences of the 9/11 myth. And the sooner we can wrap our heads around the fraud of 9/11, the sooner we can get ourselves out of this war on terror, which is destroying our nation and many other nations.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is really important. I don't know. I mean, how do you continue with this work? How do you continue to enlighten people? I mean, I think the numbers have grown. My understanding is more than 50% of the people now doubt the official narrative, but it's kind of like, well, most people now realize that Oswald didn't shoot Kennedy, but hey, that's what happened. And like you're saying, now that it's 17 years later, how do we bring this back into the forefront, and how do we start to kind of expose this for what it is and stop these repercussions from happening? Because it's gotten to be, I mean, we're so far down into it now, trillions and trillions of dollars into it,
Well, what I do is I make it very simple. When I do presentations, when I speak to people, I start with solving 9/11 ends the war.
Mm-hmm.
And, some people don't even know what war we're talking about because, as I said, the notion that the United States is at war is downplayed by the media. But, the war is, as I said, costing us a lot of money and taking us into all kinds of situations that we don't really want to be in. The military is great. The U.S. military is great. They're very, very good at doing what a military is supposed to do. We have the best Air Force and some of the best military people in the world. Mm-hmm. But a military is like a contractor who builds the house according to what the architect has drawn. The architects are the ones who have drawn this bogus war for us. And the military people are being abused into fighting an unjust and illegal war. And so it's like, I'm not anti-military, I'm not anti-American. I'm against these lies that have been used to hijack our nation and our military into illegal and unjust wars of aggression.
Right.
And that has to end, because I want peace and prosperity in our time for our nation. And it's not going to happen as long as we live comfortably with this deception that changed the world. We have to understand that.
It is one of the things that kind of blows my mind. I mean, we have spent, like $5 trillion on this mess so far? I mean, $1 trillion is so much money that people can't even wrap their heads around it. Like, we would all be wealthy, if $5 trillion got spent on us. And Americans are just getting more and more in debt, barely maintaining this sort of not even the highest standard of living in the world. I mean, I think we still it's like a figment of our imagination that we think that we're the best, or or our standard of living is so high, and we don't even see, because it's like a boiling frog, right? It's slowly, we're just getting drained of our resources by this perpetual war. And I mean, I don't know. Americans really need to wake up. I mean, we have the resources in the world today and the technology where, we should be lifting up the lower classes. We should have a strong, vibrant middle class. We should have, like you're talking about, serious infrastructure development. Instead, our cities are collapsing. What do you think is going on in terms of like the long-term plan? I mean, is it being done on purpose, or is it just a corruption of the upper classes?
No, it's being done. It's being done on purpose.
Mm-hmm.
Things like NAFTA, for example. NAFTA was pushed through Congress in Bill Clinton's first year in office by Rahm Emanuel, the guy who served in Clinton and set up a lot of the 9/11 operation prior to George Bush coming into office. Rahm Emanuel is an Israeli, agent of the Mossad in the White House under Clinton and under Obama. And he's the one who pushed it through. He single-handedly pushed NAFTA through Congress. That destroyed our manufacturing sector. Yes, this is all being done intentionally. It's being done by, big powers, big bankers, bankster elites. Mm-hmm. And they do not love America. They don't love American freedom. They're the ones who hate American freedoms, not the Muslims.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it seems obvious to me that we've got this bankster elite, like you describe, and they're transnational in scope. They're thinking, hey, we got cheap labor in China, we got cheap labor in India and Indonesia. Why are we paying Americans so much? And so they slowly bleed us out, and the American people aren't standing up for what they should be doing for themselves, which is, being able to maintain and continue to manufacture, one of the highest standards of living in the world.
Right.
Yeah, it's really frustrating to really kind of wonder, what we can do about it. While I have you, I want to talk a little bit about ISIS too, and where ISIS came from, because that's again, like we could even talk about Al Qaeda and where Al Qaeda came from, and the CIA Israeli connections there. Sure. But then how these boogeymen are manufactured to sustain the illusion, and continue to give the excuses for this perpetual state of war.
Right. Well, sure. To have a war on terror, you need to have a boogeyman.
Yeah.
You have to have somebody to go after. And the Israelis have been good at manufacturing these boogeymen for themselves in the past. People like Abu Nidal and whatnot. So they would create these boogeymen to do dirty deeds that would then give them the right to attack the Palestinians and to wage war against Lebanon, what have you. And then they did the same thing with the war on terror. Knowing that they would need to have a boogeyman, they created one. And the creation of the boogeyman, the Al-Qaeda boogeyman, and Osama bin Laden, began in Pakistan in the early 1980s, 1983, 84, and 85. That's when Charlie Wilson, the congressman from Texas, was able to get money from the U.S. government and for the CIA to begin this process. Saudi Arabia matched the funds, and then Israeli military intelligence, provided the weapons and the training. And the weapons came off the battlefield in Lebanon after the war in 1982 in Lebanon. So they basically took those Russian weapons, what have you, from the battlefield in Lebanon and sent them to Pakistan for these mujahideen, these fighters. And then what happened is that when this group that they were sponsoring, they were training a group called the Hezb Islami, the Party of Islam, Persian. And the head of the group was a guy named Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. And he was notorious for being the most incompetent resistance fighter and the most anti-Western. Yet all of the money was going to him and the weapons. Why? Because they were creating the boogeyman for the war on terror. And when this Party of God, Party of Islam, Hezb Islami, when they fell out with Saudi Arabia and fell out with Pakistan, they became Al-Qaeda. Because all these Arab guys, these Afghan Arabs, had gone and joined this Mujahideen movement in Pakistan, like Osama bin Laden. Mm-hmm. And so that became those Afghan Arabs who were in that group were trained by Israeli military intelligence. And the head of military intelligence in Israel at the time was Ehud Barak, the guy who was on British TV on 9/11 saying this is the end of the world as we know it.
Right.
Now is the time for a concrete operational war on terror. He says, we know who did this. It's Osama bin Laden.
Right.
He's the guy who trained Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden and all of these, you see, because you have to understand that the American CIA, American Defense Department, we do not have a large group of Arabic-speaking people in our country that are not. Whereas in Israel, Israel has thousands and thousands of people from Iraq or from Yemen or from Morocco who speak the local dialect, who look like Afghan Arabs. And that's how they did it. So they sent their Israeli military intelligence guys in 83, 84, and 85. And that's when the training began for the group that became Al-Qaeda. And see, so then Al-Qaeda then became ISIS. Al-Qaeda is moved around here and there, but it's all like a show. It's like an act. It's like a print-a-mob. And you put it where you need it. So that, like, in the last year, they said, oh, we have to fight ISIS. The war on terror in the last year has been fought primarily in Syria and Iraq, in two places, mostly on two very large Arabic towns, Raqqa in Syria and Mosul in Iraq. Mm-hmm. And Mosul is the second biggest city in Iraq. It's a huge city. And we pounded it, the Kurds and the Americans and the Israelis and whatnot. We pounded those two cities, basically driving out a huge block of people, the Arabs. And this is we create these refugee flows, willy-nilly.
Well, what a mess that became too. Yeah, exactly.
Oh, totally. It's all done. It's all calculated.
Right.
It's all calculated. It's all planned. So here in Europe, we've had these flows of thousands and millions of people coming in from these places that we've devastated. So why did we attack ISIS? Why did we attack Mosul and Raqqa? Oh, because ISIS was there. Well, who's ISIS? We put them there.
Right.
And Israeli intelligence runs the whole operation there. So it's like the targeting and the destruction of these countries is all being done by plan.
Well, it was amazing when ISIS was rolled out by the mainstream media. I mean, I consider myself to be someone who's relatively informed, and yet, I never heard of these guys. And then all of a sudden, it's all across the mainstream media all at once, and that's when you kind of know something is up. Because, I mean, surely the CIA knew about ISIS 6 months ago or a year ago, or what was going on. And it's like you're talking about, it's almost like a made-for-TV movie or something. I think you've even done you've written a little bit about where these videos come from, that there's an Israeli production company that basically starts to put out these videos for the quote-unquote war on terror. I mean, literally reality TV.
Yep. It's theater. It's theater. Mm-hmm. And you see it all the time with these videos that come out, and as you said, the videos come out to the Western media and Western intelligence agencies from a website in Bethesda, Maryland. And that website's called Site Intelligence Group. And Site Intelligence Group is an Israeli-run operation headed by an Israeli woman from Iraq named Rita Katz. And she provides the narration. She provides the videos to the West, and then interprets them for us. And this is, how is it that that the war on terror is being fueled by an Israeli website in Bethesda, Maryland? If these ISIS guys are so clever, and they don't like Russia, how come they can't communicate directly to Russia?
Yeah.
Or directly to the United States? No, they always go through this Israeli source. How peculiar.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's so fascinating. You can continue to look into it and continue to look into it, and then behind the scenes, you're constantly seeing that it's Western intelligence organizations that are creating this whole thing.
Yeah, but Doug, it's not just fascinating. It's absolutely disgusting.
Yeah.
It's disgusting, and it's extremely, I have to say, disappointing as an American. It brings me to despair that we have so few patriots in the intelligence community and in the government today who are really willing to stand up. It's like, I just saw the movie The Post today about the Washington Post, about the Pentagon Papers.
I've been so scared to watch that, yeah.
Yeah, but how the media showed how the media prevailed over, and justice prevailed, and the media was right. The media stood up against the Nixon administration, and they won. And here we have today, the similar scenario would be, I guess, Snowden and Assange, who are sitting in house arrest in Russia or London for years and years and years. They're basically doing the same thing. They're revealing government secrets that the government doesn't want revealed, and instead of prevailing, they're in jail for year after year after year. So it's like that shows you how far gone we are from the time of the Pentagon paper.
Well, and how funny it is that movie came out right now when these days the Washington Post is the absolute worst at pumping out American propaganda.
Right.
I mean, this whole Russiagate thing came out of the Washington Post. This whole fake news meme
Right. Bingo.
is coming right out of the
Doug,
Washington Post.
You know that the editor of the Washington Post is an Israeli. An Israeli American from Florida is the editor of the paper. And so it's like, it's exactly what you say, is that they want us to think that we live in a state where the press is still independent and challenging the government, when nothing could be further from the truth. The media is setting the tone. The media is setting the agenda, not the government.
Yeah, I mean, it is actually pretty outrageous. I mean, I've noticed this on a couple of occasions, actually, where the media pushes something and then Congress votes on, a situation. The Zika virus thing is something that just comes to mind. It was such a classic, where all of a sudden the Zika virus becomes this huge deal, and, all the babies are being born with small heads because of this horrible virus, and we need to work on it. And I did a little bit of research, and you find out that there's a lot of pesticides in the water and stuff like that probably really was causing the microcephaly, and the Zika thing is not that big of a deal. But the media rolls it out, and then instantly Congress is ready right there. I mean, this was the same thing with the Patriot Act, right? Right after the towers fell, they got the Patriot Act. Oh, it's an 800-page document, but it's ready to go. The media pushes the narrative. And, they pass and then Congress, all the congressmen are, the Congress people are like listening to the media, and all the people are freaking out. And so suddenly Congress passes the Patriot Act, or they pass, $5 billion to pharmaceutical companies for some Zika virus vaccine. I mean, and then, of course, the thing that just dies. I mean, even the ISIS rollout, like ISIS rolls out and then it dies. Nobody's, paying attention hardly to ISIS at all anymore, except for theoretically, it was the U.S. that kicked, even though it was Russia that got ISIS out of Syria.
Right.
They try to pretend like the U.S. is in, and then they sneak. I mean, God, that was just something that recently happened. And then all of a sudden there's boots on the ground in Syria, which should have been a huge deal. And I knew that was going on. And I'm sure you knew that was going on. But when the mainstream media finally admitted to it, they pretended like, oh, yeah, there's boots on the ground in Syria. It's no big deal. Of course the Americans are there. We had to help kick ISIS out. I mean, that's all they said. It's like, no, what are you talking about? This is huge, It's just amazing to watch the media manipulation, and then the way that manipulation affects our Congress. I mean, Congress, just as soon as the media rolls out some horrible, scarce story, then Congress will vote whatever. The people are all freaked out. Congress votes, and then, the job is done. The deal is sealed.
They set the agenda, and they set the tone. And as they say, I don't know about Donald Trump's personal habits, but they say he watches a lot of TV.
Yeah.
I sent him my book, because my War on Terror book is very small and to the point. And I sent it down to his address in Palm Beach. I hope he got it. But, if he watches TV, and then he's likely to be, thinking about the things that they're talking about. That's how it works.
Yeah.
They set the agenda. The media sets the agenda, and they're not accountable. They're not accountable. And that has to stop. That's why it's great to have, independent, productions like yours.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I've just felt like I had to start doing this. I actually started doing this on my local radio station, which was also an NPR station, and the NPR crowd basically made it so difficult to have honest discussion that I had to move on to the internet,
Oh, good for you.
Yeah, I mean, but it was crazy even. I mean, I live in Northern California in our small community that's typically open-minded. At our local radio station, it's very difficult to have a 9/11 truth conversation. We certainly could never have this conversation on the air there without causing a major issue,
Really?
Yeah, it's actually surprising. I was surprised that... I'll even say to the point of the station was losing money. I mean, there's enough people around here that want to hear this information. I think that's true all over the United States. I mean, hence Donald Trump's, having to court the quote-unquote conspiracy, or independent media in order to get elected. I mean, it's become common knowledge. Enough people know that it's out there, and enough people are attracted to it that it's actually a significant voting bloc. And yet there's still... it's just so interesting. I mean, the media manipulation is so complete, and it's almost like people are so scared to awaken out of it. I mean, it was the NPR faction at my local station. They just want to believe that NPR is telling them the truth. They want to believe it.
Yeah.
And anybody that disrupts the NPR narrative is literally a crazy person. I mean, they just can't hear it. It's like an amazing kind of, I mean, again, two towers fall straight down at free fall speed into their own footprint. How it's like I've come to realize that it's a mass brainwashing that they can't see that that's a demolition job. Like, how can you not look at it and know what that is? I mean, it shouldn't even be controversial.
Right. You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. Your analysis of the situation is absolutely correct. And it's like, yes, this is not what you're seeing, people. This is not what you're seeing.
Yeah.
The ability to use mind control in the mass media in the United States is now perfected, probably more than it's ever been anywhere else on the planet.
Yeah.
Because they've used the techniques of the Russians and the East Germans and the Israelis and everybody, so that now it's so fine tuned that people listen, like you said, to NPR, and they think they're really getting the truth.
Right.
This is, like you said, this is really, these people speak so softly and they're so nice, and you have such a warm and fuzzy feeling listening to NPR as they lie to you. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's just it. I mean, like, the Americans are victims of propaganda, and because the quality of the propaganda is so high, like, most of the time when you think of propaganda, you're thinking of, like, Pravda in the Soviet Union, where everybody knew that it was just the government lying to them, and it was so obvious, and you're getting the government lying and whatever. But in the United States, people actually believe it's the truth. They think it's a free press, and they're getting the truth. And how do you break that spell? That's the real trick to it.
What does Fox News tell you? They tell you it's fair and balanced.
Yeah.
Fair and balanced. And the Washington Post has a logo, something like "Democracy dies in the dark."
Yeah,
something like that. And the New York Times always has had that motto in the upper corner. It says, "All the news is fit to print."
Right.
So that's how it works. But the American people are now finding sources like you and alternative sources on the media. But the problem there is that there's a lot of controlled alternative media, like Alex Jones, and people tend to think that, well, if it's alternative, it must be truth.
Yeah.
Not the case.
Yeah.
You really have to, your critical thinking skills have to be finely tuned. Otherwise, you'll find yourself being deceived by the next guy.
I got to tell you, to me, that's the biggest characteristic difference from the alternative media. And anyone who's listening to this, I really want you to pay attention, is that don't trust anybody that tells you that they're telling the truth. Only trust people who ask you to do your own research. Don't take my word for it, people. Look into it yourself, because if you're not saying that.
If you look up my name on the internet, Christopher Bolin, you'll see a lot of slanderous pieces.
Yeah.
Tons of it. And people say that I'm anti-Semite or this or that.
Right.
And what you find in the 9/11 so-called truth community is you find a lot of people who will attack me or Richard Gage, saying that we're like lying or something like that. And these are attacks against us as individuals because they want to discredit what we're doing, what we're saying.
Mm.
And I can't speak for everybody. I know Richard Gage, he's a great guy. I think he's done a great job in bringing 9/11 truth to American people. But I know for myself, that everything that I've written or said or done regarding 9/11 or journalism is the truth, the absolute truth that I have found it. I can make mistakes. I've made several mistakes in my reporting in the past, but so that if somebody's attacking me on my writing about 9/11, I know that they are either misinformed or they're working for the other side.
Right.
They could be misinformed into thinking that I'm a bad guy and they're attacking me, but then you would be a little bit more humble. But when they're attacking me viciously, when they're attacking Richard Gage or when they're attacking Dr. Jones from BYU,
right,
then they're probably working for the other side, because what they want to do is that they want to confuse the listener. They want to confuse the person, the other people in the community. They want 9/11 truth community to be divided and divisive, broken apart from each other, arguing with each other, arguing over things that don't matter. Like exactly what happened on 9/11. We don't know, and we probably won't know until we have subpoenas and a proper investigation. Mm-hmm. But we certainly know that we've been lied to for 16 years. And the lie was used to take us into this god-awful war that's cost us an arm and a leg. We know that. You know, details, the minutia of what happened at the Pentagon is not so important unless it brings us better clarity about who did it. But we know who's behind the war. We know who's behind the deception. And there's a lot of Americans involved.
Right. Well, I want to get into this. We've been talking for a little over an hour. I'm willing to go for, another 15 minutes or so if you've got the time. And I wanted to get into this because I know that you have been attacked for being anti-Semitic. But when I was reading your work, I mean, facts are facts. It's like if the state of Israel is or the Mossad or intelligence communities, or if there's something, behind the scenes that's doing all of this, and I commend, your ability to kind of go behind the scenes and check out these interesting connections. I mean, I think a lot of people have in a sense fallen for this, is that, you want to say, oh, the Saudi Arabians did it, or, I mean, even people in the 9/11 truth movement, like you're saying, we don't know exactly what happened, but you'll dig a little bit deeper and find that Israeli connection behind the Arabic front that's there in a lot of cases that suddenly says, man, maybe it was the state of Israel had a lot more to do with this than at first glance, but then you get kind of hammered for it for being anti-Semitic. So will you talk about, something I'd like to actually get a little bit out of you is the real complete history. I mean, we don't have all the time in the world, but how did Israel get started there? What the Likud party is so very conservative and militant, and then why they're trying to control the situation so much, why they need to have so much influence in the United States, why they're getting the United States to engage in these wars in the Middle East, what's going on there, why they're working so hard to control our perception, do so much perception management. What you found there behind the scenes, and then give you an opportunity to talk about this charge of anti-Semitism.
Okay, well, very simply, the state of Israel was created primarily by Britain, and the founding document of the state of Israel would be called the Balfour Declaration from 1917, which was basically a personal letter written to Lord Rothschild.
Right.
And he's the head of British Jewry. And the letter promised British support for the creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. So that's where it all started. The Rothschilds played a key role in the development of the state of Israel. You can read all about it in books like the Encyclopedia of Israel and Zionism. But the Rothschilds built the first 30 settlements there. They built Rishon LeZion. They funded the state of Israel in the beginning. And they built the Knesset, a lot of other buildings there, Supreme Court, what have you. So you have to understand that the Rothschild, this international banking family, is kind of like the hinterland for the Zionist international movement. They don't live in Israel. Some of them do. One of the heads of the Israeli military intelligence is a Rothschild. But
oh, wow.
In any case, Danny Rothschild, he's the head of strategy and policy, I think, at the international at their school in Herzliya. Interdisciplinary Center, IDC. And he works closely with Ronald Lauder, which is part of my 9/11 presentation. But the point is that, so Israel is a little country of maybe 3 or 4 million people down there in the Middle East, but it punches way above its weight because it has the Rothschilds behind it. It has the city of London behind it. It has the Oppenheimers. It has New York City. It has Zionists in the United States and London who are much more Zionist than the people in Israel. If you can believe that.
Right.
They're much more radical. They're much more, they're gung-ho because their skin's not on the line. Their kids aren't out there in the IDF uniform.
Well, that's what's so interesting, if I can just interject, is that there seems to be this longer-term plan manufactured out of really the British Empire. I mean, with Israel and Saudi Arabia, you see Israel working with Saudi Arabia to concoct these, Al-Qaeda and ISIS and things like that. And this all comes out of British colonial history, I mean, in the Middle East. I mean, these are long-term plans laid by, people in Britain and the United States, this elite class, and you can just watch. They've been manufacturing it. It's not even the people of Israel that are doing it. It's these small groups of people, primarily, I think, starting with the English colonizers that have created this entire situation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's it's the same situation you have is who is the guiding light? Who are the powers in this imperial scheme? And, the financiers are, of course, a very big part of it. and that would be the Rothschild family. You know, like the British government, the English government, the American government, all need financing, all need to be propped up. They need money all the time, and the money has to come from someplace, and the money is being lent by the Rothschild banks.
Right.
And so it's like now, now the U.S. government is on borrowed funds again. It's always on borrowed funds, and they're having to make another deal. So they have to make these deals with the devil all the time about who's going to fund the government, and it means that the piper has to be paid. And so the same thing in Britain. What if you read in my book Solving 9/11, I write about who controls our governments, our political parties. When you had like Tony Blair or the Prime Minister of Britain, you always find that he has a key person behind him who's advising him, who in his case was called Lord Cashpoint. He was like Lord ATM because he was the Rothschild agent who was advising Tony Blair. And we have the same thing in our government. We have whether it's Donald Trump or Obama or what have you, they have a Mossad guy at their right hand who tells them what to do. In the case of Obama, it was very clear. He was created by the the Chicago Jewish group, headed by people like Philip Klutznick. But in the White House, his first appointed person was Rahm Emanuel,
right?
The Israeli soldier who ran the White House. And it's like, that should not be allowed in an American White House. You shouldn't have an Israeli, advising the president. But and it's the same thing as like every year, every time we get a new president, you have this bizarre photo that pops up on the internet of the president sitting there with a bunch of Chabad Lubavitchers, these Jews with these fedoras and all this getup that they have, standing around the president. He's like he's signing something for them or doing something for them. Every single president. So it's like this completely non-American, un-American group prevails in the White House.
Mm-hmm.
Our government has been hijacked, as the British government has been hijacked. We're not doing this for American interests, even American imperial interests or British imperial interests. There are other interests that prevail over American interests.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is true of Congress too, where the people in Congress have to sign a pro-Israeli, compact when they get in office, and if they don't do it, you basically get shafted. You're not getting any campaign funds for the next election. You're going to be out.
That's right. That's right. That's right. There's a book called "They Dare to Speak Out," which is a history of congressmen and senators who were run out of Congress, like Pete McCloskey and Charles Percy and what have you, and they were run out of Congress because they took a pro-Palestinian point of view.
Right.
And sometimes they're killed. And some congressmen who stood up against the war that we're in right now, like the good Jewish congressman from Minnesota, his name was Wellstone, Paul Wellstone.
Mm-hmm.
He and two of his daughters died in a mysterious plane crash in Minnesota because he was up against the war. And the strange thing was, I found that an FBI team from Minneapolis was on their way to the crime scene before the plane had crashed.
Oh, wow.
So it's bad.
So many instances where you can find, they're preparing the troops for Afghanistan before 9/11. They've got the Patriot Act set up and ready to go before. Like, you can, if you start to look into it, like it's just become so obvious, that these governmental organizations have been co-opted and they're not performing their actual functions to work for the American people, but instead they seem to be working for this larger. I mean, I see it as an extension of basically the British Empire, but even European colonialism from the last 500 years. I mean, we have this mythology in the United States of having a revolution, but somewhere along the line, it seems like the revolution, the ideas behind the revolution were co-opted, and the whole United States apparatus was brought back into the fold of this colonizing force that is trying to, unite the world. One interesting thing that came to mind was that I know that Russia has, for example, paid off all of its debts. It doesn't have a foreign debt anymore to these bankers, and just another reason to add to the list of why Russia is so demonized. They're not controlled. I mean, United States, quote-unquote, greatest country in the world, $21 trillion in debt to these people, Russia, evil, zero debt to these people,
That's right. That's right. and you're enslaved by the debt.
Yeah.
And that's the problem. We're enslaved by the debt. We're enslaved by the lies. So we have a real tough road to hoe here. We have to get out of the debt. We have to solve that problem, and in order to be a solvent nation, and we have to get back to truth.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And then when you start talking about things like this, I mean, you get branded as either a nationalist or an anti-Semitic. I mean, it's so easy for everything to get twisted to like you're a Nazi because you're talking about these things, and it's just like, but isn't this what's really going on? It's not has nothing to do with a person's spirituality or where they go to church or what they do. It just has to do with with politics and power and war and killing people and debt slavery and things that we should all be standing up against. So how come when we talk about it, you suddenly become a Nazi?
That's right. And when I talk about 9/11, it's a crime, and when I talk about the war on terror, it's a fraudulent war. And if you point out that some of these characters or suspects are Israelis or Zionists, those are political or national terms. Those are political terms.
Right.
It has nothing to do with their ethnicity or their religion. That's beside the point. We're not having an ethnic discussion here. We're not having a religious discussion. We're talking about a crime. We're talking about political events. And you have to be able to talk about these things frankly and openly, without names being called, slanders being issued.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that there's no question that the criminals, the very people that are perpetrating these crimes, are taking advantage of this sleight of hand by trying to say, oh, if you're anti-Zionist, then you're being anti-Semitic. It's like, no, I don't like, I don't like what this political movement is talking about. It's just like, whatever, not liking socialism or communism or capitalism or whatever your political point of view is. And yet these criminals have managed to take advantage of this linguistic sleight of hand to paint you in a negative light. I mean, it's just, it's an ad hominem attack, really, without ever paying attention to the real facts behind what's going on.
That's right. That's right. It's a trick. And there was an Israeli politician named Shulamit Aloni. She was on the radio with Amy Goodman, and she told Amy Goodman, this is a trick we use all the time. She said, in Europe, we use the Holocaust, and in America, we call them, if they're critics of Israel, we call them anti-Semites. She said it works very well.
Wow. Yeah, amazing.
And Amy Goodman couldn't believe it, but she knows that's the case. I mean, that's how it works.
Right.
it's a ploy to silence criticism.
Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty amazing. And I know that people like yourself, I mean, you actually will quote, Jewish people all the time. There are plenty of Jewish people that agree with this perspective. And you work with the Jewish people, and so it has nothing to do, with what their religion is or what their background is. I mean, if people are awake to what's going on, they're reporting on it. If they want to stop, the endless wars, if they want to stop these handful of very wealthy individuals from taking advantage of the rest of us, it just doesn't matter what your background is. You should be on board with, trying to help the mass of humanity here, and prevent needless death.
A decent human being.
Right.
Exactly right. Exactly right. Well said.
Well, all right, Christopher, we're knocking on an hour and a half here, so I guess it's probably about time we should wrap it up. Do you have any concluding statements you want to talk about? Just what you've been doing in terms of trying to wake people up. I mean, are there movements that you're seeing right now, to end on a positive note, where there is the potential for more of a mass awakening and the ability for people to do something about this?
Yeah, well, I have written several books about 9/11. They're called the Solving 9/11 set of books. The little book is called The Deception That Changed the World, and the big book is the collection of articles called The Original Articles. And then I wrote this book, The War on Terror, The Plot to Rule the Middle East, which is very small and easily read. These books can be gotten through Amazon.com, or you can get them through my website, Bollyn.com. It's BOLLYN.com. And it's a good place to start. And I go on speaking tours. I'll be in America next week. I'll be in Florida. I'll be in Orlando on March 3rd. There's a group called Face of Truth, and they're having a little get-together there in Orlando, Florida, on March 3rd. And that's where people put their picture along with the banner that says, I am the face of truth. Well, it's to bring awareness of 9/11. And how can we do this? We have very small voices. You, me, and compared to the mainstream media that speaks to millions when they open their mouth. How do we go against such a monstrous force like that and reach people? We can only do it one by one.
Yeah.
You know, it's the way we have to do it. We have to spread the news, spread the awareness one by one, and we have to build resistance in our country. We have to build critical thinking skills, and we have to build the intelligence and the backbone of our people to stand up against this fraud. That's all we can do, and it's what we have to do.
Yeah, I almost thought it was exciting. I mean, it said something that in this last election that they had to acknowledge the power of the voting bloc of people that are starting to wake up to all of this. And I don't know what that means. And my hope is that, I mean, these guys are such masters of manipulation that they haven't neutralized it. They haven't put Trump in office, you know, in part to sort of neutralize this movement by thinking that, oh, we've got, you know, we're being paid attention to. Trump believes in us. I mean, there's some people that have kind of fallen for that. And I hope that people, you know, don't let it slow them down, that they still manage to, you know, try to rise up and get their voices heard, because it'll get co-opted. You know, these guys are they are masters of co-opting, you know, movements and then twisting them and then just incorporating them into the left-right paradigm or whatever it is. And suddenly it's business as usual. No one's getting prosecuted for these major crimes, you know, and everything gets swept under the rug. And I don't know. We can't let it happen. We got to keep plugging away.
That's right, Doug. That's exactly right. And you do that, and I'll try to do the same.
Yeah, well, that sounds like a plan, Christopher. Thanks a lot for being on the show. I just want to remind everyone who's listening, if you really like what you're hearing, please think about becoming a patron. I could use the support. It's patreon.com/The Shift. Check out my Facebook page at The Shift with Doug McKenty. I'm on Twitter at DMcKenty, and theshiftnow.com is my website. All my archives are there. A little bit more of an explanation of the show and what's going on here. Trying to slowly make a difference. I really appreciate you, Christopher, for your work and what you've been doing. And I'll think about giving you a call again. It's just nice to talk to somebody, even if I like focusing on 9/11, and I'm really glad that we did, because I haven't done a show on 9/11 yet, but it's just nice to be able to talk to somebody about politics and current events and what's really going on, because there's, God, the misinformation, what's about Russia,
Mm-hmm.
you know, we kind of touched on it all. Russia, Syria, we could have talked about Ukraine, I'm sure, you know, and so much of what's going on in the world, but I'd love to be able to have you on again, just to kind of have a more general conversation to just clarify to people, you know.
Well, thank you. I look forward to it.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Christopher. I really appreciate it.
All the best. Thank you.
Yep, you too. Have a great one.